One of the most common questions I get asked is, when do I repot my plants? It's sort of second only to where do I cut the spike. The short answer to that question is you want to repot plants just as they're beginning to produce new root growth. Typically that's in the spring. The late winter, early spring into early summer period is the best time, because that's when the days are getting longer, the days are getting warmer, the plants more rapidly establish themselves. You want to avoid repotting in the heat of summer if you can. Why? Because it's hot. It may be dry depending on your part of the country. It's a very stressful situation, and if you can avoid that, that's better. You also want to avoid repotting in the fall and winter months. If you can avoid it, it's sort of last resort. The reason for that is the days are getting shorter, the days are getting colder, the plants are growing less rapidly, they establish into new pots more slowly. As an aside, that's sort of all off the table if you grow your plants under lights. If you're growing inside under lights in a controlled environment, you repot your plants at the proper root growth stage, because you're not fighting the shorter days and colder days and longer days and heat and that sort of thing. In most cases, the new root growth begins with the flush of new growth, but that's not always the case. If you look at Phalaenopsis, Phalaenopsis produce new leaves and new roots almost continuously throughout the year. The correct time to repot these plants is just after they finish flowering. When the last flower falls off, cut the spike, take the plant out of its pot, clean off all the old potting mix, slip it into its new pot, fill in around it with new potting mix, and very rapidly establish itself in its new pot. The proper pot size, by the way, is a pot that is just big enough to contain the roots. In these plants that grow upward, so-called monopodials, you do not want a big pot. You want a pot that's determined by the root system, not by the size of the foliage. In some orchids, like the Oncidium alliance, new root activity occurs very late in the growth cycle, in the development of the new growth. If you look carefully at this new growth, it's about 3 inches long. There's absolutely no sign of any new root activity in this plant. If you look at the old roots are dry, they're not active, there are no little new green root tips. Even a growth that is this size is just now beginning to start showing signs of new root activity. If you look there, there's a very small new little green branch root tip forming. That's a sign that this plant is just approaching the point at which new root growth would begin, and it would be a candidate for repotting. In Cattleyas, new root activity typically begins when the new growth begins, but not always. Here's an example of one that comes along very late in the growth cycle. This is the new growth. Notice how well developed it is. There's no sign of new root activity at the base of this plant. However, if you look at the old roots do branch. This old root is just now beginning to produce a branch rootlet. This is a sign that a new root collar will begin to erupt around the base of this growth, and it would be time to repot this plant. So we're very, very close here. As we said, new roots start typically in Cattleyas when the new growth is just beginning. You can see the new growth here, and a cluster of new roots just beginning to form at the base of the growth. You need to be very careful. These roots are actually at their most dangerous stage right now. If these root tips are damaged, the root is so short that it will not be able to branch. Old roots do branch, and I'll show you that in a moment. So this is actually a little past the point where you safely would repot this. Another comment I'd like to make is look at the established old roots. They are branching, they're still growing, but they've wrapped themselves around the stake, the hanger, and it would be very difficult to get this off the pot without doing terrific damage to the root system. What you'd be better off doing with this is taking a set of bolt cutters, cut the stake and throw it away. You might want to shatter this pot and take the front piece of clay pot and pot the whole thing into a new pot. That clay pot is not going to cause any problem. It's actually going to act as drainage, and the roots aren't damaged. Here's another example of roots that can be very easily damaged when they're this length. If you look carefully here, you'll notice that there are roots beginning to form, new roots that are attaching themselves to the pot. There's a collar of roots forming here. Also look very carefully, you'll see that that little green root tip is flat. That's because moving this plant around, we broke that root tip off. This root is too short to produce branch rootlets in the next growing season, and I've effectively lost that root. So you need to be very careful if the roots are too far along. You're better off waiting until the second root cycle when all the old roots begin to produce branches and transplant repot then. And you can see that here. If you look carefully at this old root is producing branch rootlets all along its length. Any root about 4 inches long would be fine. That brings us to the question about, can I cut off old roots? Well, you can trim off old roots that aren't active and won't probably ever reactivate. That's not a bad idea. You want to take roots that are active and trim them only enough to get them in the pot. How do you tell the difference? You can gently, look at this root, this is very thin, it's wiry. If I pinch it gently between my fingernails and pull, the outer coating will come off of the wiry center core. There isn't much substance in between those two layers, and this root could be simply removed. If you look at this root has much more substance. If I pinch it gently, there's substance between my fingernails. If I were to break it, you'll notice the green inner covering. This is called velamen. This root is active. This root you would keep. You trim it only enough to get it into the pot. You can see on that root that there's a little root tip beginning, and this is a perfect indication that that root is active and should be saved. So what's the perfect point? The perfect point is when you see a cluster of new root tips forming at the base of the growth, and you can see them here. This is the perfect stage, being very careful not to damage those roots, to repot this plant. So let's recap the question, when do I repot my orchids? When new growth is just beginning. Typically in the spring, when the days are getting longer. Early summer is about as late as you want it to be. Avoid late fall and winter because the days are colder, they're shorter. The plants don't establish themselves as quickly as they should. You also want to avoid the middle of the summer because you're simply going to fight the heat and dryness and fresh potting mix drying out much more rapidly.